Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in. It's Monday morning here. Hope you had a good weekend. Probably busy for most people. It was for me as well. I try to keep up with the grading as stuff comes in, really for my own good, so it doesn't pile up so much. But you will hopefully get grades back relatively soon, either after due dates or even a little bit before, if you have done the work and all of the requirements. Sometimes the discussion boards require responses, so obviously you have to wait until there's other people who've posted their own messages or their own essays or responses as well. Anyway, just looking at due dates here, and I guess we should point out that even though last week, our first week, was abbreviated because Monday was a holiday, it still counts as one of the weeks that of our class, so we're 1 down and 4 to go. It really goes fast. But at least we're into our first full week here and just into our due dates. So we've done introductions. We've looked very quickly and briefly at Milton and Paradise Lost, again kind of with a view towards how certain of the themes that are important in that work were derived from Milton's very real experience in the world. It's not just a case of him kind of creating this epic as this lone solitary poet removed from the events of the world around him. But also how so many of the important themes of free will, rebellion, choice, all of that kind of stuff would also really inform the Romantic poets. And so we get into a phase of Romanticism now, and you'll find a good PowerPoint kind of introduction to some of the main themes in Romanticism, the Romantic movement. It's a relatively short literary era. If you think of someone quintessentially romantic like William Wordsworth, he's born well before it starts, dies well after it ends. So someone like him, that entire movement is encapsulated within his life, and he certainly is writing actively beyond the end of the Romantic period. So in many ways these kinds of dating things are certainly convenient for us academically, but are just that, a convenience sometimes. They are a way of identifying sort of a time period marked by particular either literary or social political events, and then of grouping writers together who sort of followed a conventional idea or theme, or not conventional, but maybe a unifying theme or idea, but for as many characteristics that define a particular period, we could find those being employed by writers outside of the period, and we could find writers within the period who didn't follow those conventions. And again, I don't want to call them conventions or tradition or norms, even though that's kind of what they become, because in a lot of cases, like the Romantic period, it really is picking up that theme of revolution and change. It really is a period where poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge set out to do something different poetically, not just it turned out that way, but quite consciously. And one of the things that we'll read a little bit later on, like days from now, is their preface to the Lyrical Ballads. The Lyrical Ballads was just a collection of poems, but the preface to it was like a manifesto for a new style of poetry, a new way of writing, a new series of subjects that were worthy of poetry. And in fact, the unit we get into here with Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, it is not itself a particularly romantic work. It still has a lot of sort of holdover from a more traditional neoclassical style. But one of the things that it does is quite consciously, it talks about the poor, right? The uneducated. And for the longest time, those subjects just weren't the stuff of poetry outside of maybe the occasional stock character, which they're really not in Gray's work. So Gray, and then the other unit that we're coming up to, Unit 4, where we look at some women authors of the period, they're really proto-romantic or pre-romantic, if you want to call it that, although again it's so hard to define those boundaries in any clear way. Someone like Wollstonecraft is really interesting, the mother of Mary Shelley, who would write Frankenstein, again a prototypical romantic work and author. But the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft was in some ways very non-romantic, in the sense that if the Romantic era privileged the imagination over the intellect or reason. Of course, if you could separate those two out, right, it's sort of artificial. If the Romantic era privileged the imagination over reason, then certainly we find in Wollstonecraft a continued emphasis on reason as part of this pre-Romantic or Enlightenment thinking. But we also find someone who is very much interested in social change, really one of the first feminist writers, or certainly the first feminist writer we encounter in this course, and a figure who's important to keep in mind, of course, for her own sake, right, when we read her, but also we can trace how she shows up, or her influence shows up, in other feminist authors like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and then later on someone like Virginia Woolf will become very important. So a lot of our early units, people like Milton, Gray, Wollstonecraft, interesting in their own right. I don't want to take anything away from them individually, but they begin to set up these kind of strains of thought that we'll see re-emerging as the course continues. That, to me, is one of the most positive aspects of organizing around a time period like 1800 to present, which in other cases is really artificial, like the 1800 even causes us problems as far as, like I mentioned before, most Romantic era dating systems begin well before, or at least a couple of years before 1800, so it's artificial. But that kind of chronological look really allows us to see historical connections, or sort of the history of ideas as they develop and are traded off. If the pre-Romantics, the Enlightenment era thinkers were very much about reason, like Milton's argument about reason being the fundamental basis for how we make choices within this sort of domain of free will, Wollstonecraft's arguments in Vindication of the Rights of Man and of Woman again rest almost exclusively on the power of reason to make obvious, or what she claims are obvious, choices. That gets traded then for this much more obvious emphasis on the imagination in people like William Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge during the Romantic period. And then we find in the Victorian period, the one that follows the Romantic, a kind of movement back towards the idea of reason, or what Matthew Arnold would call right reason. So again, that chronological view gives us an interesting way of framing ideas, not just in and of themselves, but kind of relative to other ideas, and how the pendulum tends to swing from one side to another as these literary eras kind of react to one another and look to break away from what ultimately become kind of tradition, convention, and the norms of one literary period. Okay, so I'll lead you to the content, then much more specific stuff in the units themselves. Be sure you're keeping up with the due dates, reading assignments carefully. There's lots of really great work being done. So I really encourage you, as much as time allows, honestly, to get into those discussion boards. And even if you're only required to respond to one or two, click yourself into a number of them, and you'll see some really energetic responses. There's really fully developed essays being written by a number of people in the course. So we're off to a great start. Keep it up. It does get, tiring. There's no other way around it. So just stay focused for the next few weeks, and we'll all be good. As always, if you have questions or anything's going on, just let me know, and I'll get back to you right away.